The Cockatrice Boys by Joan Aiken, Chapter 1. Nobody seemed to know where the dreadful things came from. Some people said one thing, some said another, but experts mostly agree as to the day of the evil invasion of the British Isles first began. It was a wretched rainy Sunday in the month of September. Recently the winters had all been bitterly cold and snowy, while the summers were shorter, windier, and wetter. On this September Sunday, people were coming home from their holidays, flying in from Sardinia and Spain and Sicily. For most of them, wherever they had been, the weather was so nasty that they hardly felt they had been away. Tired, disgruntled passengers disembarked from their planes at the big airport outside Manchester. They scurried through the streaming rain to the airport building, then filed slowly through passport control and began waiting in the baggage claim hall for their luggage to arrive. Soon, they hoped to see it come sliding up a moving ramp, tip over the top, and come slithering down to a traveling circular platform. All the passengers squeezed as close to this platform as possible, hoping to be the first to grab their own bags and hurry off to customs. But a whole lot of time passed by. People waited and waited. They grumbled more and more loudly as they gazed at the luggage belt, which kept sliding by with nothing on it. "Only 20 meters walk from our plane," said one woman. "A one-legged rheumatic snail with athlete's foot could have fetched the luggage faster than those handlers are doing it." "Snails don't have rheumatism," snarled her husband. "And I told you, Brenda, only to bring carry-on luggage for a weekend in Brittany." "It wasn't a weekend, it was 5 days." I can see something coming," said a small pig-tailed girl who was with her aunt. She had red hair and looked thin and sad. Oddly enough, from where she stood, it wouldn't have been possible to see anything coming up the ramp, but she turned rather pale and her mouth opened in a silent gasp of fright. And then, in a moment, something did come rolling over the summit of the ramp and toppled down the other side. "That's not proper luggage," said the woman called Brenda. It certainly wasn't. It was an enormously large, lumpy, shapeless sack, tied at the neck with thick rope. It seemed to have some object inside it the size of a sofa, but not at all the shape of a sofa. The thing, whatever it was, must have had as many corners, dimples, bulges, dents, points, swellings, creases, and gibbosities as a 7-ended pineapple. The sack which contained it was uncommonly thick and stout, rather grimy, as it had traveled half across the world, covered with tags and labels and scribbles, and colored in wide stripes of orange and purple. Almost at once it was followed by another sack of a similar kind, and quite as large, but a different shape. This one was long, about the length of 2 beds put end to end, but lumpy, fitted with a bit of sack covering a kind of prong that stuck up at one end. "Maybe there's a camel inside it lying down," guessed the pig-tailed girl. "Don't be silly, Sona," snapped her aunt. "People don't send camels in parcels. Oh, my stars, I wish our luggage would come. I want to get home. I want my tea." Everybody wanted to get home and have their tea. Still, the luggage did not come. Instead, more and more of the large, mysterious sacks came trundling up the ramp and tumbling out onto the moving circular beltway, until the whole circle was covered with them, gliding along one after the other, like a lot of purple and orange ghosts. "Where the dickens can they be?" people were saying. What the dickens can they be?" people were saying. "Who do they belong to? Why doesn't somebody claim them? It's not right. There's no room for our luggage with all these things out there. With all those things out there." "Maybe they're musical instruments," said the woman called Brenda. "Maybe they belong to one of those pop groups." "Oh, sure," snarled her husband, whose name was Ron Glommix. "And what stage in the whole world do you think is big enough to hold all those outsized objects? And what do you think they are? Super pianos? Alf horns?" "Matterhorns, more like," somebody said. "Anyway, if they are instruments, where's the group they belong to? Perhaps they come from Mars and got stuck at immigration." I'm going to complain," said Ron Gilmax. The moving belt was now completely packed with the big shapeless bags, wedged tight as dominoes in a box and all shiny with wet. "One of them moved," cried the pig-tailed girl. "Nonsense," said her aunt. "Stop fidgeting around, Sona. You stay close by me and behave yourself." At the end of its track, the moving belt traveled through a hole in the wall, beyond which was the outside area where the handler stacked the baggage. The hole was screened by a curtain of swinging leather straps. Beside it was a door marked "No Exit for Passengers." Ron Glommix opened this door and put his head out, but the rain outside was coming down in blinding sheets, so he pulled his head back in again, grumbling that it was all quite disgraceful. By now, strangely, the number of sacks began to decrease. Gaps appeared between them. Then the gaps became wider. Nobody was seen to take a bag off the belt, yet there were fewer and fewer, until, at last, there were hardly any at all. "They go under the curtain, and they don't come in again," said the girl called Sana. Then she gave a whimper of horror, and her eyes grew enormous, and she cried, "Oh, I can see something huge!" "Quiet, will you, for goodness sake," said her aunt. "Thank heavens, there comes our blue case at last. You hold my handbag while I reach for it." But Sana stood trembling uncontrollably for several minutes before she was able to obey her aunt's order. People were happy to find their luggage, or were so happy to find their luggage that they soon forgot about the big lumpy bags. Nobody wasted any more time wondering who had sent them, or who picked them up, or where they had gone on to that streaming wet Sunday in late September. A couple of months went by before the first of the cockatrices, for that was what they came to be called, made its appearance. On a dark, freezing December evening, a truck driver called Sam Dwindle burst into his foreman's office looking very upset. He was white and sweating, and he shivered badly despite the thick jacket he wore. Yeah, I know what you're going to. I know just what you're going to. I just know what you're going to say," he told his boss. "But listen to this. An hour ago, when I was coming up the A3 from Portsmouth on the new bit of bypass, I seen this thing with big three-corniced flaps along its back and a tail the length of a tennis court and round ears that swiveled like radar shields. It was running along beside the motorway on its four fat legs, running as fast as I was driving, and I was doing 70. "Then you didn't ought to have been," said his boss. "Not with a load of wine glasses. I suppose you'd put in a couple of hours at the George in Milford." "No, I hadn't then," said the driver injured. "I knew you wouldn't believe me. But if you don't, I'm sure I don't care. I'm telling you, if that thing had taken a fancy to cross the A3 instead of going off Dorking Way, your truck would have been as flat as a Brillo pad, and me with it. It had a tassel on its tail," he added, "and flaps there too." "And a bow of pink ribbon on its head, I suppose," said his boss. Okay. You can give me my cards if there's going to be things like that around. I'm going back to window cleaning. The next of the cockatrices was sighted by a school botany class who were out on the moor near the town of Appleby under Scar, 200 miles to the north of the first occurrence. They were hunting for rabbit and deer tracks in the snow. Two boys, Fred and Colin, had run on ahead of the rest, but they came racing back to the main group as fast as their legs would carry them. "Miss, come and see! There's a dinosaur in Hawes Dell." "Now what moonshine have you got in your heads?" remarked the teacher, Miss Frobisher. But the whole class hurried up the lip of the dell and looked down into it. "Gracious me, someone must be making a film," said Miss Frobisher. "But that's not an ordinary dinosaur, Colin. It's Tyrannosaurus Rex. You can tell from its teeth and claws. The claws are at least 8 inches long, and the teeth..." "Will it bite us?" nervously asked a girl called Lily. "No, dear, it's only a model, a very clever one indeed. I wonder where the cameramen are, and the film technicians. Dear me, what a lot it must have cost to make a model that size." "It's coming this way," said Fred. "Coo, it doesn't half stink," said Colin. "Like a whole truckload of rotting seaweed. Are you sure it's only a model, miss? Now, Colin, use your intelligence. You know there aren't dinosaurs about anymore. They lived millions of years ago." "Look at its tracks in the snow," said Lily. "Aren't they huge? Listen to it pant, miss. I'm scared. I want to go home." "Don't be a baby, Lily," said the teacher. "Just when you've got a chance to study this very clever model, which must be radio-controlled, now you can see what it would have been like to live millions of years ago." Those were her last words. The newspaper carried the story of the mysterious disappearance of Miss Frobisher and her class. "Their tracks were traced as far as the top of Hall's Dell," reported the Appleby Herald, "but heavy snow falling soon after prevented the police from discovering where they had gone after that. A local farmer, James Robson, claims to have seen what he describes as a mammoth footprint in the snow, but there has been no confirmation of his suggestion that some large beast was responsible for the strange fatality. Mr. Adrian Mardle, Chief Constable of Westhumberland, is in charge of the case." The next sighting was by an old lady, Mrs. Ada Backett, who lived in a high-rise apartment block in Glasgow, 200 miles northeast of Appleby. Hannah," she said to her daughter, who had come to cook her supper, "there's a face in the window looking in." "Oh, come on, Ma, be your age," said Hannah from the kitchenette where she was cooking fish fingers. "How can there be a face in the window when we're 30 floors up, unless it's an angel wanting to watch Neighbours?" "There's a face," repeated the old lady obstinately. "I can see its two big sad eyes the size of porridge plates. I'm going to—" Then there was silence. Hannah walked in the next minute with a dish of fish fingers, found nobody in the room. "It was quite a shock to me," she reported that evening on local television, "because there's no other way out of the room. So where could Mum have gone? The window was shut and locked, and the flat it's 30 stories up. Queer disappearance of great-grandmother, the newspapers called in. Then there was the business of the Christmas tree at Chiddingly. The residents had, as usual, erected a 20-meter tree in the middle of the village green and decorated it with lights, tinsel, and colored fruit. On Christmas Eve, a party was always held on the green, organized by the chairman of the tree committee, Colonel Clandon. Carols were sung, the lights were lit, and the whole village danced hand in hand round the tree. "Hey," called a boy named Michael, pausing to stare up at the star-filled sky. "Hey, look, there's something up there." 3 or 4 people heard him and gazed up likewise. They saw that the stars were being blotted out by what seemed like a huge inky cloud. From this cloud, something hung down which swept in circles, with a faint whistling sound, and from the very center of the blackness, 2 great pale luminous eyes glared down at the revelers. Suddenly, with a loud sucking snap, the Christmas tree was uprooted from its fastenings. It flew upwards like a pin raised by a magnet. Gasps and yells of indignation and fright rose among the dancers. "Hey, what's going on? Put back our tree. What kind of joke is this?" "If it's that aerial club from Wormfleet with their helicopters," began Colonel Clandon, but he said no more. The carol singers at Chiddingly, like the school children of Appleby, vanished forever, sucked upwards into the dark, like spilt sugar into a vacuum cleaner. Very soon the population of the British Isles had become noticeably smaller. Cars stood around without drivers. Houses appeared to be empty. Bus queues were very much shorter. Babies' prams had no occupants. High streets of towns were empty and silent at midday. In 5 years, half the country had become a desert. Buildings had fallen or been knocked flat. The whole of London had gone underground. People didn't dare venture out in daylight anymore. Shops were hidden in cellars. Parliament sat in a dungeon under the Tower of London. Schools were held in crypts. Even the royal family lived in the basement, which was all that remained of Buckingham Palace. "Things can't go on like this much longer, Harold," said Lord Ealing, the Prime Minister, to General Grug Pennington, the Minister of Defence. "No, they won't," added the Defence Minister. "Soon there won't be anybody left at all." The 2 men were sitting on deck chairs on the Piccadilly line westbound in Leicester Square tube station. Nobody else was there. "I wonder where the monsters all come from in the first place," mused Lord Ealing. "None of our scientists can seem to agree about that. Do you suppose they can all have grown up from some nasty bacillus, or mutated? Oh, who cares where they came from? The point is that very soon they will have the whole country to themselves. The Snarks are the worst," said General Grug Pennington, with a shiver. "How can you tell? You've never seen a Snark." "Of course I haven't. Everybody knows if you see a Snark, you vanish." "I'd rather vanish than be munched up by a flying hammerhead." Remember that football match between Ipswich and Nottingham Forest? Hammerhead got the goalie just as he was going to make a beautiful save, sighed the Prime Minister. That was the last match played above ground. The two men sat in silence for a while. Then Lord Ealing said, Harold, I want you to set up a Cockatrice Corps. People had fallen into the habit of calling all the creatures cockatrices. There were too many kinds to remember their individual names. Kelpies, telepods, bicorns and gorgons, foot monsters, brontothares, shovel tuskers, glyptodonts, bonacons, cocadrills, peridexians, basilisks, manticores, hydras, trolls, sphinxes, and chichivasses, and worst of all, the deadly mercandole. The country was completely infested with monsters. They had grown and multiplied, inbred and increased as fast as tadpoles in a pond. So far as could be ascertained, the British Isles seemed to be the only territory at present affected by the disaster. Strict quarantine regulations, hastily put into effect, had up to now protected European, African, transatlantic countries and the Antipodes. Various attempts to end the siege of the infested islands by means of long-range missiles had proved wholly ineffective. The missiles simply melted before arriving at their targets. The situation seemed hopeless. A Cockatrice Corps, repeated the defense minister doubtfully. But what about transport? How would they get about the country? By rail? Underground? I don't think that would be feasible. No, we shall construct a special armor-plated train capable of running above ground. But what fuel will it use? Stocks of oil, coal, and gas had long ago been exhausted. People had to manage without. The train will run on wind power, or maybe solar energy, or stellar energy. There's plenty of that. Better than solar, said the general. The monsters raise too much dust by day. This was true. Monsters flying in swarms over the dry, bare ground raised such thick clouds of dust that the sun was hardly ever seen, and even before fuel had run out, aircraft had stopped flying. The dust got into their compressor blades, and the engines caught fire. And wind power, said Lord Ealing. There's plenty of that. Or diesel bricks. A wind-powered armor-plated train. That might be a possibility. All the old tracks are still there, as far as we know, pointed out Lord Ealing. Gregory Clipspeak would be a good man to put in charge of the corps, but it would be a most dangerous mission. We'd have to call for volunteers. You'd get plenty. People are fed up with living underground. Very well, said the defense minister. I'll set up an operations room at once. And that was how the Cockatrice Corps came into being. While the engine of the Cockatrice Bell was being lovingly assembled by skilled volunteers in London, the food shortage in some northern towns was becoming more and more severe. It's not a case of tightening belts, said the provost of Manchester. It's got down to eating them. One November day, the Hempfield's District Emergency Warden took a look at his afternoon's agenda and saw that he was due to pay a call on Mrs. Florence Monsoon at number 15, Brillcream Court. This was a melancholy, run-down council block, and number 15 was on the 5th floor. Up 5 flights of battered concrete stairs, dashed over the staircase walls were various dramatic portrayals of monsters executed in spray paint, but these had been done several years before, when the monsters were still a novelty. Now the pictures had faded, as had the enthusiasm for doing them, and the supply of spray paint had long since run out, and the artists had, many of them, been swallowed by the monsters, so the walls beyond the 3rd and 4th stories were mostly undecorated, and there were no pictures at all on the corridor walls leading to Mrs. Monsoon's front door. But the inscription, very low down, as if it had been done by a dwarf for a 4-year-old child, read, Mrs. F. Monsoon is an old witch. The warden, whose name was Mr. Mossready, shook his head at this, as he lifted the metal knocker on the door and gave it a couple of sharp raps. Electric bells in Manchester had long since ceased to function. After his knock, there followed a long, suspicious silence inside the flat, though Mr. Mossready felt fairly certain that he could hear someone moving around inside, and a woman talking in a low voice. He rapped again. By and by, he became aware that he was being observed through the tiny glass spy-hole by a hostile pale green eye. "Who's that?" snapped a voice. "The warden." "How do I know you're what you say? There's all sorts about these days." For answer, he held his warden's badge up to the spy hole, and, after another extended, unfriendly pause, the door was very slowly drawn open. Inside stood a thin, scraggy woman with a long, pale face, gray hair done in a bun on top, and a gray apron, which had once been white, tied over a lot of cardigans worn in layers like onion skins. "Mrs. Florence Monsoon?" "Who else should be living here?" she demanded. "Who else is living here? That's what I want to know. You applied for an extra ration of carrots for your niece, Sonna Blow. Where did she come from?" There was no niece mentioned before when the ration cards for meat and bread were issued. "She don't eat no meat nor bread, only carrots." "Why?" "That's her business, ain't it? Oh, well, I suppose you best come in. Don't need to have the whole building sticking their noses into my affairs," grumbled the woman, giving a sharp glance up and down the empty corridor, as if elephants' ears extended quivering from every closed door. The warden followed her through a lobby about the size of a chair seat into a very small living room. In the middle of the room was a card table covered with a hairy brown cloth, and on top of that, one of yellowed lace. Round the table were crammed 4 chairs with red velour seats. The walls were covered by display shelves, and in each corner but one there were triangular chiffoniaries. The 4th corner held a dead television set, and the rest of the space was taken up by small coffee tables with spindly legs. On one of these stood a multitude of tiny china mugs and jugs, each with an inscription from some seaside resort. A present from Margate, a present from Blackpool, a present from Ryde. There must have been thousands of them. It seemed that Mrs. Monsoon had been busy dusting them, for she held a piece of rag, which she now tucked into her waistband in a martyred manner. A brown tile fireplace held a paper fan in a jam jar, and a small potted palm stood on the windowsill, blocking off any light. Dusting all these little things must take a tremendously long time, thought Mr. Mossready. Tired at the very end, thought. All day, most likely. Every day. "Well," snapped Mrs. Monsoon, "what nosy parkering set of Paul Pryes sent you along here?" "Food, rationing, and public security." "Public security, ha! Not much of that these days." Mr. Mossready displayed his badge again and drew out a long form like a scroll, which he had wrapped around a dead ballpoint pen. But while he did so, his eyes were fixed in fascinated disapproval on a girl who sat motionless on the opposite side of the card table, with her back to the window. The reason she couldn't move was that her hands were tied tightly with straps of rag to the back of her chair, one on each side. Her cheeks were extremely pale. Her red hair was done neatly in 2 plaits. She gave Mr. Mossready a weary glance, but said nothing. She did sniff a little, though, as though she would have liked to blow her nose. The warden wondered if she had been crying or if she had a cold. "Are you Sonna Aslaga Blow?" he asked, consulting his form. "Daughter of Ted and Emily Blow of Newcastle upon Tyne?" "Yes, sir." "Your parents are dead, and Mrs. Florence Monsoon is your guardian?" "Yes, sir," she said again sadly. "That's right." "What relation is she to you?" "Father's cousin," put in Mrs. Monsoon. "Why, might I ask, do you keep the child tied up?" At this, the girl's eyes flew nervously to the woman. "Well, what a question," said Mrs. Monsoon acidly. "I should have thought any fool could see the reason for that. The child's so active and restless. The very first day she was here, she smashed 11 of my precious souvenirs. Naturally, I wasn't having any more of that. Since then, except at meal times, which she takes in the kitchen, she has had to have her hands tied." Mr. Mossready glanced at the kitchen, which he could see from where he stood. He had not been invited to sit down. In fact, there would scarcely have been room. The kitchen was the same size as the front hall, with sink, stove, and cupboard arranged round the sides of a standing space. "Mrs. Monsoon, how long has the child been living with you?" 5 years, ever since her mum and dad was killed in an air crash in Spain, just before the Troubles, that was." Sana was heard to sniff again. "Why does she not eat meat and bread if available? Is she on a special diet, a vegetarian?" "Meat and bread make her too active, wouldn't they?" demanded Mrs. Monsoon. "There'd be no hiding her once she gobbled a lot of stuff like that, so that's why I put in for extra carrots." "Do you like carrots?" the warden asked Sana. She nodded resignedly. "Oh, very, very well. In the circumstances, I am prepared to show the application." He made a tick on his form. "Does the child ever get out?" "I don't see as it's any of your business," said Mrs. Monsoon coldly. "But yes, she does, when there ain't too many snarks about." "And how do you expect to have her residing with you? Does she have any other friends, relatives, people to care for her? If something should happen to you," the warden said delicately. Mrs. Mossready was not one for rushing in where angels fear to tread, but he did feel this arrangement was highly unsatisfactory. The child looked so very pale and glum. When he said other friends, something slightly odd appeared to happen to Mrs. Florence Monsoon. The pupils of her gray eyes dilated and began to shine, as if they were made from small blobs of mercury. She stared at the warden for a few minutes without answering. He looked into her eyes, lulled into a kind of waking trance by the bright points of light in their pupils. It seemed to him that he could hear a shrill, tiny voice, like that of a gnat or mosquito, which whined plaintively somewhere up above him near the curtain rail. "I don't like it here. How much longer do I have to stay in this airless ugliness? When can I rejoin my friends? Abiron, Asmodeus, Belial, Chamath, when can we play together again in air and darkness? I was not told I would have to hover here in a trap, in a horrible trap." The voice ended in a bat-like squeak. "I beg your pardon, what did you say?" Mr. Mossready was exceedingly startled, and more than a little scared. The child had not spoken. He'd be prepared to swear. Her lips were pressed tightly together, and she had been looking down at the yellow lace cover on the brown hairy tablecloth. But the voice had not seemed to come from the woman either. Could he possibly have imagined it? A voice up there above his head, near the dead electric light bulb and its fringed lampshade. Mrs. Monsoon was still gazing at the warden in a strange, sightless manner, her eyes like 2 silver nail heads fastening something down in her blank face. Now the girl spoke. "It's just Aunt Floss's hearing aid, sir. It does go like that sometimes, so does the kettle. It's just the airwaves round here. Aunt doesn't hear ordinary sounds so well when it's like that, but I don't mind it so much here, you see. I'm waiting, I'm hoping." "Hoping for what, child?" "Hoping for my cousin Dakin to come along," explained the girl. "He's way off still, but I'm pretty sure he will come by and by." She was talking very fast and softly with a wary eye on her aunt. Mrs. Monsoon suddenly gave her head a quick, angry shake. "Cousin, what are you talking about, you silly girl?" she snapped. "Hoping for your cousin Dakin? Indeed. I'd like to know what use he'd be. He's only a bit of a lad, somewhere down there in London, probably ate up a long time ago by a pteropod. Don't take notice of the child, Mr. Mossy. She talks a right lot of nonsense at times. Gets silly notions in her head. It's all I can do to keep my patience with her." The woman's eyes were normal again now, her pupils dark, the same as anybody else's might be, and the bat-like squeaking voice from the radio speaker, could it have been, except who had a radio these days, was silent. Quickly, uneasily, Mr. Mossready rolled up the public health form again, nodded at the two inmates of the flat, and stepped back toward the entrance door. "When can my friends come and play?" whined the tiny voice, hurriedly. Not far from panic, Mr. Mossready stepped out the front door and slammed it behind him. Standing in the passage, he thought he heard Mrs. Monsoon's angry exclamation, "Hush! Not yet! I've told you over and over!" There's something downright peculiar, not at all what it should be, about the setup in that place, ruminated Mr. Mossready, making for the staircase. But what can I do? Nothing. As it should be these days. I'm sorry for the poor child, though. As he reached the stairhead, a fat woman was struggling slowly up. He could hear her puffing and wheezing while she climbed the last flight, so he waited politely on the top step. "You've just been visiting Mrs. Monsoon?" asked the woman as she came level with the warden and paused to get her breath. "She's at home, then, is she?" "Yes, she is," said the warden, hoping to get a little more information about the forlorn child. Are you a friend of Mrs. Monsoon?" "Oh, no. No, mister. Not to say a friend," declared the fat woman hastily. "More of an acquaintance, like a neighbour. She gives readings, you know, Mrs. M. does. Cards, dreams, tea leaves. She's from up north in Scotland. See, where the nights are so long, and they can all see in the dark. Clear seeing, they call it. Mrs. Monsoon can scry, like." Then, growing nervous, wondering if she had been indiscreet, she said, "Not in a crystal ball. Don't get me wrong, mister. Nothing like the gypsy, nothing of that gypsyish sort. No funny business, and never for money. She reads hands, see, gives advice. It's all ever so ladylike and refined. Nothing nasty at all. Money never changes hands." "Wouldn't be much good if it did," reflected the warden. Money had long since ceased to be of any importance or use. The woman pushed hurriedly past him, leaving a strong aroma of garlic behind her. "Does the child help her?" asked Mr. Mossready. The disapproval in his voice made the fat woman even more nervous. No, not to say help, mister. Not to say help. Oh, dear me, no, that wouldn't be legal, would it? But of course she's there, in the room. Can't help that, can't she? If she sometimes lets fall a word or two. She's got to speak sometimes, don't she? Truth to tell, she can see through walls at times, that kid can. Useful gift, ain't it? Wouldn't mind having the knack myself. Right handy it'd be when the rent collector comes a-calling for his 10 pairs of hand-knitted socks." She laughed wheezily, then gave Mr. Mossready a cautious glance, trying to guess his reason for being there. "Well, we all got to do the best we can for each other these awful times, don't we?" she added vaguely. She waddled off along the passage toward Mrs. Monsoon's door. Staring after her uneasily, Mr. Mossready noticed for the first time that she had a dog with her. Or had it been there, lurking in the passage all the time? Or was it a dog? Something smallish, about the size of an Aberdeen terrier, scuttled along the corridor, keeping close to the angle of the wall. "Maybe I'm coming down with the flu," thought Mr. Mossready, rubbing his brow. "They say there's a real nasty virus going about. Affects your hearing, makes you think you hear bird calls and cats mewing, makes you think you see peculiar things that aren't properly there. For I could have sworn what I saw scurrying along the passage was not a dog, but a face, running on 6 legs, looking up at me with a nasty grin as it went. What I need's a nice cup of hot turnip tea to go with my mint and parsley sandwich." Reassuring himself, Mr. Mossready patted his jacket pocket, and for a second time wiped his brow, which was covered with a shimmer of sweat. "I'll be right glad to get out of Brillcream Street. The ventilation in this building is very poor, and that's a fact. Nasty odours about, something like rotten eggs with a dash of hot melted metal in there as well." So Mr. Mossready was decidedly put out at being waylaid again down in the lobby by yet another stranger. You'd think, from the look, that this building was mostly deserted, he thought. Rubbish scattered all over the floor, no proper maintenance, peeling paint everywhere. So quiet you could hear an ant hiccup, yet there seemed to be a lot of odd bods about. The man who now intercepted the warden at the foot of the stairs could certainly be described as an odd bod. He was extremely thin and pale, so thin that his face looked like a skull. A cowlick of lank hair hung over his white bony brow, and two doleful mud-colored eyes peered about as if they had never seen anything to interest or please them and never expected to. The man wore a kind of gray canvas uniform and carried a nasty-looking tool, part spade, part billhook, part cleaver. "Afternoon, sir," he addressed Mr. Mossready politely enough. "I reckon it's just about afternoon now, eh? Sun's climbed as high as it's going to, wouldn't you say?" He gave a sniff at his own flight of fancy. "Noon to you," mumbled Mr. Mossready, wishing the man would step out of his way and let him go by into the fresh air. "Now I wonder, sir," said the man without budging. "I see you are an emergency warden, sir. I see it by your badge. I wonder if by any chance you would have been calling on Mrs. Florence Monsoon." "Now why would you think that?" snapped Mr. Mossready, not at all pleased at being interrogated about his professional pursuits by this scruffy stranger. "It's just, sir, that, to the best of my knowledge, Mrs. Monsoon is the only resident of this building these days, unless, of course, you were inspecting the block as to condemn it as unfit for human habitation." The mud-colored eyes were fixed searchingly on Mr. Mossready's face. "No, that is not my function," said the warden. "Anyhow, compared with some, this building's not too bad. Who are you, may I ask?" he added, still wishing the man would move out of his way. "Tom Flint, sir, dog operator, under the latest regulations section 22B of Clause 79, Functions of Local Government Officials, 15 August last year. I am empowered to search out and destroy any unclaimed domestic canines." "Oh, is that so? Yes, I see," interrupted Mr. Mossready, still trying to get past. "Excellent, very proper. Can't have unclaimed mongrels roaming all over the city." "And you tell me that you have recently made a professional call on Mrs. Florence Monsoon, sir, and that you would say she had no resident canine pet in her apartment?" "I didn't say that I had called on Mrs. Monsoon," contended Mr. Mossready peevishly, "but as it happens, I was in her place, and not greatly impressed by the state of affairs there, I may say," he went on, more to himself than to the other man. "The child seemed very much in the dumps. Don't care to see a young'un kept under restraint like that." "A child? The occupant of number 15 has a child residing with her?" inquired Tom Flint. His tone, which had been rather vague, now turned quite sharp. "What concern is that of yours, pray?" snapped Mr. Mossready, trying to edge past the dog operative, who had a dank, musty, sweaty odor about him which combined most unpleasantly with the stuffy atmosphere of Brill-Cream Court. "Why, kitties and dogs go together, don't they? You get a kitty in a flat, 9 times out of 10 you get a puppy too, or a kitten, or a hamster, or one of the canary birds. And pets breed, you know. One thing leads to another before you know where you are. There's a whole drawer full of white mice, a kennel full of tykes, or half a dozen moggies. Sometimes that's clean against present-day regulations. Now, to save me trouble, sir, would you declare you had seen nothing of that nature in Mrs. Monsoon's place?" "No," said Mr. Mossready a little uncertainly. Tom Flint pounced. "Aha! There was something dicey. Not quite as it should be. You smelt cats, perhaps, or heard birds a-tweeting?" "No, I didn't. No, I did not. Nothing like that, but there was a queer voice." Mr. Mossready wished more and more that he could get away from this annoying interruption and find a quiet place to eat his parsley sandwich and get a cup of something hot. "A parrot, maybe," suggested Tom Flint. "Parrots can do funny tricks with their voices." "No, nothing like that," Mr. Mossready repeated. "Just a voice. The radio, perhaps." He scowled at the other man, waiting for him to say that since there was no mains electricity in Manchester and batteries were not to be had, he could have heard no radio. "I tell you what I did see," he said suddenly, to his own amazement, found himself volunteering. "I saw a face running along on legs. Right nasty it looked." "Ah, a face on legs. Tom greeted this statement without the slightest surprise. "So where was that, then?" Up yonder," Mr. Mossready waved to the staircase, "outside Mrs. Monsoon's place. Maybe it came with the woman who was calling on her." "A face on legs. Did it have a collar?" Mr. Flint asked. "I saw none. Right nasty it was," Mr. Mossready repeated. "Had a spiteful grin. Made me feel queer." Tom Flint surveyed him. "What you need," he said in an unexpected tone of friendly sympathy, is a herbal donut and a mug of hot rhubarb wine, and I know just the place to go for that." This seemed such an attractive program that Mr. Mossready felt inclined to ignore his first mistrust of the man who suggested it. "That does sound champion," he said. "Would it be far from here, though? I've another 3 calls to make in this area." "Nay, not a step. Just round the corner. A gaffer I know has his own stall down by the ship canal. I'll show you. Just you come with me. He brews his own rhubarb wine, fresh-picked rhubarb that grows in the ruins of the town hall. I've had it many a time, and I can tell you it's better than tea." "Tea," sighed Mr. Mossready, following with docility as his companion led the way round the street corner and along a narrow alley between piers and rubble, and so down to the towpath where the canal ran greasily between huge ruined buildings. "There, do you see? Along there." Sure enough, Mr. Mossready did think he saw a makeshift stall, built from old bits of lath and galvanized iron, and behind its ramshackle counter a man was boiling a kettle over what looked like a Bunsen burner. The flame of the burner flickered between the stall-holder and his customers. Mr. Mossready could see nothing of him but a vague misty shape. Tansy tea or hot rhubarb punch," he said in a low creaking voice that came alongside the counter. "Tea for me, punch for my mate," Flint told him. 2 thick china mugs were filled with steaming fluid. Mossready was preparing to take a sip when Flint stopped him. "Nay, man, that's not the way. Inhale. A grand sniff of the steam first. That will relax the coats of the stomach. Hold your nozzle right over, that's the way, and breathe in, hard. Once, twice, 3 times. Tom Flint and the shadowy figure behind the counter watched with calm interest as Mr. Mossready inhaled the 3rd breath and began to stagger uncertainly across the towpath. "Feels like you can hear the music of the spheres are whirling round your head, don't it?" said Tom Flint in a quiet, solicitous tone that gave he gave Mr. Mossready a sharp push between the shoulder blades, which sent him plunging into the canal. Just before the waters closed over his head forever, Mr. Mossready heard Tom Flint ask in a pleading tone, "Did I do well, master?" But what the answer was, if indeed one came, the warden did not hear. And that is the end of Chapter 1.